Okay, Panthers. So here we go. Today, we're going to talk about the 1920s, and this is just a broad overview of the 1920s. The 1920s is a very bizarre, very weird time in American history because it seems like the country's moving in two completely different directions. We're becoming more and more urbanized. And as that's happening, science is becoming much more important. Intellectualism is becoming more dominant feature in American society, and people begin moving in a very, very progressive manner, I guess you could say. At the same time, there's a backlash to this modernistic movement, and there's a desire to go back to the way things were. And rural America becomes the values of rural America become very, very important, and America becomes moving in a very, very traditional manner, and a society where religion, Christian religion, begins to play a very big factor. And they look at the city with a lot of suspicion and a lot of angst. And people in the city look at these uh, people who are trying to move America into a more traditional um, area. They look at them with a lot of, oh, I guess you could say just a lot of disdain towards them. So the country seems to be moving in two completely different directions at the same time. It's a very weird, as the slide says, contradiction. So just some really quick facts about what's happening. By the time we get to 1929, 70% of all Americans live in cities. Remember, we have that tipping point where right around 1900, more and more people are living in the cities. More people live in cities than live in the rural areas. By 1929, 70% of Americans will live in the cities, and that number will continue to grow. Over the course of the decade, the literacy rose by 6%, meaning that 6% of people, well over half of the American people, could read or write by the time we get to 1929. Average life expectancy goes up from 49 to 54. This is in due to people working in less dangerous, less physically demanding jobs over the course of the decade, better health care, better access to health care. So the life expectancy increases. Today, the average life expectancy, I think, is in the 70s. Women tend to live a little longer than men, mostly because, guys are dumb and do dumb things. So we tend not to live as long as women. But the life expectancy today is certainly much older than it was back then. The United States is still producing the world's oil. U.S. Two-thirds of the world's oil is still produced in the United States. If you're buying oil, chances are it's American oil that you're buying. 15 million cars are on the road in America during this time. People that are making more money so they can afford more cars. So more and more cars are becoming much more prevalent on American roads. 18th Amendment is passed, which outlaws alcohol. It's known as the Noble Experiment. It fails miserably, but we do pass a law in an attempt fulfilling this long goal of many prohibitionists and progressives of getting rid of alcohol. And then the big one, the 19th Amendment, give women the right to vote. For the first time in the 1920 election, women are allowed to vote. Yay! So there you go. That's just some really quick information. Also, during 1920, civil rights becomes very prominent again in American society. Civil rights has always had this undercurrent in American history, going all the way back to our founding almost. And at times, civil rights becomes a very, very important issue, and then it is not as important, but it's always kind of there churning under the surface. Again, in the 1920s, civil rights becomes a very prominent issue in America. And this guy here, 1920, his name is Marcus Garvey. And Marcus Garvey was an early civil rights leader during the early 1900s. And in 1920, Marcus Garvey creates UNITA, which stands for Universal Negro Improvement Association. And it's just an early civil rights organization aimed at improving the lives of African Americans. In August of 1920, Garvey and UNITA host a month-long conference in Harlem, which is a predominantly African American uh, area in New York City. Lots of artistic output come from here during this time. This is the Harlem Renaissance. So it is an epicenter of artistic endeavors in America. And so because of this very large African American population, Garvey and UNITA have this month-long conference in Harlem to discuss how best to address and fix the racial problems in America, the segregation and some of the other problems. At the end of the conference, Garvey announces that he's come up with a solution. And his argument is that American society is never going to accept or treat African Americans as equals. And the only solution for African Americans to achieve full equality is to leave the United States. And Marcus Garvey actually buys some old cruise ships and calls it the Black Star. And the cruise ships are, the intent of the cruise ships is to be a one-way ticket back to Africa. This is known as the Back to Africa movement. Okay, the idea being we've got to go back to Africa so we can have a better life. And that's the only way that African Americans will ever have true equality. So this is the Back to Africa movement. It actually buys cruise ships. Not a lot of people take him up on this. It is representative of this increased and renewed interest in civil rights for African Americans in the United States. And this will be a recurring theme throughout the 1920s, the civil rights and the lack of civil rights for African Americans and other minorities in the United States. 1920 is also an election year. So we're going to elect a new president, Woodrow Wilson, who was elected president in 1912, reelected in 1916. Woodrow Wilson in 1919 has a massive stroke in Pueblo, Colorado. He's in Pueblo, Colorado, giving a speech trying to drum up support for the League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles. And as he gets back on the train in Pueblo, Colorado, on his way to Denver, he has a massive stroke, completely incapacitates Woodrow Wilson. This is all hidden from the public. Woodrow Wilson will never again appear in public. And obviously, he supposedly says that he's not going to run for re-election in 1920. Chances are he just didn't know that because he was so incapacitated. Here's a little hint, winky, winky for you. He's pretty much incapacitated. He really can't function as president anymore. And this is kept from pretty much everybody. Even people in his own cabinet didn't know how bad Wilson had been affected. But there's still bills and laws being signed and vetoed coming out of the White House. So how is this happening? Well, we've already had a woman president. Woodrow Wilson's wife, Edith, was acting as president during this time, and she was the one who was making decisions on what bills to pass and which bills to veto, in which actions the White House was going to take. She was acting in place of Woodrow Wilson, who was no longer able to do that, fulfill those duties. Well, there's something for you. So, 1920, we're going to have a new president. The Democrats nominate a guy by the name of James Cox. You probably haven't heard of him for a good reason, because he loses. Republicans nominate a well-known senator, well-liked senator. Name is Warren G. Harding. So why do they choose Warren G. Harding? That's his picture there. Why do they choose Warren G. Harding? Well, because he looks like a president. He's not smart. He's not extraordinarily smart. He barely graduates from high school. Never goes to college. He's not a good speaker. He's not a good writer. He's not known as an intellectual in any manner. It's just the Republicans go, when you think of a president, you think of Warren G. Harding. He's the stereotypical look of a president. So that's why he gets elected. Huh. Harding's campaign is a return to normalcy. Now, there's two levels to this campaign slogan. First level is the obvious meaning of return to normalcy. We just came out of a war, World War I. Wars are not normal. Things are different during wars. We're done with the war. Let's get back to normal. The subliminal message, the below the surface message for return to normalcy is it's normal for a Republican to be president. From 1860 to 1920, we have exactly two Democrats as president. Woodrow Wilson is a Democrat. Let's get back to normal. Elect a Republican. Harding wins big time. There's the map. Now, what is significant about the Democratic ticket is who they nominated for vice president. He's a young, upcoming star in the Democratic Party. He's also a name. He has a name that everybody, particularly Republicans, will recognize. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt, who will become president in 1932, is related to Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt is his cousin. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt is a rising star in the Democratic Party. And to capture, in recognition of his rising star, and hopefully to capture some votes because of his well-recognized name, Franklin Roosevelt is nominated as vice president in 1920. And that is a picture of Franklin Roosevelt when he was about your guys' age. He's in his late teens in that photograph. So that's Franklin Roosevelt. How about that? All right. 1920s have all sorts of scandals in it. Okay, lots and lots of scandals. Harding's cabinet is notoriously corrupt. Harding has a bad judge of character. A number of his advisors go to prison. One of his advisors, he's one of his members of his cabinet, he appoints to his cabinet after meeting him over a beer in a bar, in an illegal bar, drinking illegal liquor, because remember, we got prohibition. Warren G. Harding meets him in this illegal bar and goes, you're a pretty good guy. And he nominates him to his cabinet. Turns out the guy has been to prison for theft and other things. So just an incredibly corrupt cabinet. The biggest scandal comes in 1923 when there was a lot of oil that was missing from an oil reserve in oil reserve in Wyoming called Teapot Dome, because there was a big hill at this oil reserve that resembled the dome of a teapot. Now, the United States government buys lots and lots and lots and lots of oil that we keep on reserve, just kind of standby in case we need it, a national emergency or we're invaded or something like that. We need access to a lot of oil very quickly. The United States has a lot of these reserves. During a routine audit at one of these oil reserves at Teapot Dome in Wyoming, it was discovered there was a lot of oil missing. The Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, was accused of selling off this oil because he's the one that's in charge of the oil reserves. And all of a sudden, he was doing huge upgrades to this huge ranch that he has in New Mexico. And Albert Fall really couldn't explain how he was getting the money to do these upgrades. It was later found out he was selling these oil reserves to large oil companies and then pocketing the money. During this investigation, Warren G. Harding says if Albert Fall is guilty, then I'm not fit to be president. Within a week of saying that, Warren G. Harding died. He has a massive heart attack in San Francisco. It is now widely believed that Warren G. Harding was actually killed by his wife. It is believed that his wife slowly poisoned him over a long period of time, and eventually the poisoning caught up with him in San Francisco in 1923. Why would his wife do this? Well, Warren G. Harding liked women a lot. And he had numerous affairs. He fathers at least one child out of wedlock while he's president. And his wife has just kind of had it with his philandering. And so she slowly poisons him over time. So Albert Fall ends up going to prison. And vice president Calvin Coolidge becomes the president. Calvin Coolidge is known as Silent Cal. Why is he known as Silent Cal? Because he really doesn't say a whole lot. That's why. He's a man of few words and even fewer actions. Another issue during the 1920s is immigration. Immigration is just exploding in the United States, especially after World War I. There's a tremendous crush of immigrants coming into the country, escaping the problems in Europe. As a result of all these immigrants coming in, we see an increase in xenophobia, which means fear of foreigners. Americans are becoming increasingly convinced that foreigners are going to ruin the country. There's a fear that all of these foreigners are going to come in. We're going to have to be competing with them for jobs. They're going to lower the standard of living because immigrants will be willing to work for a lower wage than regular Americans. So something's got to be done, right? We've got to have some process, the belief is, to control the number of immigrants coming into the country. So here's the problem. In 1919, there's 110,000 immigrants come in the United States. 1919. I mean, that's a lot, but it's not crazy. 1920, 430 immigrants come in, 430,000 immigrants come into the country. Woof! That's a 400% increase over a year. Hokey smoky. 1921, 850,000 immigrants enter into the United States. Holy cow! In a 3-year period, we've had an 800% increase in immigrants. 1919, 110,000, we can deal with that. 1921, 850,000, that's a lot. And looking forward in 1922, we're probably going to have well over 1 million immigrants coming into the country. That's unsustainable. So in 1921, the United States is going to pass its first immigration law, its first real immigration law. The United States had never really had an immigration law up to this point. If you showed up, you could prove who you were, you had paperwork and so on, you were in. Now, we do pass a law, the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s, that we didn't want any more Chinese. But Europeans, we were fine. So now we're going to pass our real first immigration law aimed at restricting the amount of immigrants coming into the country. You got to stick with me because this can get very, very confusing and be as clear as mud if you're not with me. So in 1921, they passed the Quota Act. And here's what it means. 3% of immigrants that came from each country in 1920 would be allowed to immigrate. So what they're going to do, they're going to look at the immigration rosters from 1920, look at each country where all these immigrants came from, and they're going to look at the number of immigrants that came from each country, and then they're going to limit that number to 3% that can immigrate in 1921. So for instance, they look at 1920, and let's just say, just to keep it simple, 100 people immigrated from England in 1920. So they now apply the Quota Act going forward. 3% of that number will now be allowed to immigrate, or 3 English immigrants will be allowed into the country. Okay? And we would do the same for each country. If we had 200 come in from Germany. Then going forward under this law, we'll allow 6 German immigrants coming in. Great. Well, that still doesn't allow in, that's still allowing in too many immigrants. And actually, if you look at the cartoon there, that's what the cartoon is showing, all these immigrants in the funnel trying to get to the United States. And Uncle Sam is sliding in that gate in the funnel. It says 3% to limit the number of immigrants coming in. So in 1924, we're still having too many immigrants coming in. So they're going to change the number. They're going to reduce that quota number to 2%. And then they're going to look at the 1890 immigration instead of the 1920. And here's why. In 1920, we're getting a lot of the bad immigrants, a lot of Italians. God, we hated the Italians. We did not want the Italians. They were lazy and they smelled and they were dumb and just all these things about Italian. God, we hated the Italian immigrants. And we're getting in a lot of Greeks, and the same thing about the Greeks. We're getting in a lot of Russians, same thing about the Russians. These were the bad immigrants. We didn't want them. So if we go to the 1890 immigration numbers, we have a different set of immigrants coming in. 1890, most of the immigrants are coming from northwestern Europe. A lot of Irish, a lot of English, a lot of Welsh, a lot of Nordic people coming in at that time. Now, in 1890, we hated these people. Remember, we didn't like the Irish. But now, since they're not the big group coming in, we like the Irish. So they're going to reduce this number to 2% and then look at the 1890 immigration numbers. And this is going to favor Northwestern Europeans, the good immigrants. We didn't have a lot of Southeastern European immigrants coming in 1890. So we're going to get even fewer of the quote unquote bad immigrants, right? This is a phenomenon not unique just to the United States. Every country in the world has this. Whatever is the big immigrant group coming into that country at that time, there's a real prejudice and real bias against that immigrant group. And it's always the same argument. They're going to compete for our jobs. They're going to lower our standard of living. They're going to destroy our culture and our society. And that's reflected here. Okay. So this leads to the nativist movement, this belief that only those who are born in the United States are trustworthy or good, right? This is the nativist movement. If you're a foreigner, you're not as good as a native-born American, okay? Now, this belief, nativism and xenophobia, leads to this resurgence of the KKK. KKK, remember, comes about at the end of the Civil War in reaction to Reconstruction. And the United States government essentially declares war on the KKK, and it's pretty much a dead organization. But then in the 1920s, the KKK is going to have a resurgence, and they will become a very well-respected organization, really, in the United States during the 1920s, because they become equal opportunity haters. Not only do they hate African Americans, nay. Now they hate immigrants and Catholics and Jews and all of these people that don't seem to fit into, quote unquote, America. And they become a very large, very powerful organization during this time. This picture here is from 1925, and the KKK hosts a major rally in Washington, D.C., and hundreds of thousands of KKK members show up in Washington and march down Pennsylvania Avenue in their robes and hoods, proclaiming themselves as protectors of American society and the American system and America itself. In Colorado, the KKK becomes very, very powerful. A number of members of the state legislature are members of the KKK, and they're very open about it. They're very proud. They would put that on campaign flyers. Proud member of the KKK. There are a lot of members of the United States Senate who are members of the KKK. In 1926, the KKK marches through Old Town Arvada. and they go to St. Anne's Church, which is the big Catholic church in Old Town. They go to St. Anne's Church and they burn several crosses up on in front of the main doors of the church. And then they go to the field across the street from the church, which is now a parking lot. And they burned several crosses in the field there across from St. Anne's Church. And then they marched around St. Anne's Church and broke out many of the stained glass windows in the church. After that, the KKK then marched up Wadsworth Boulevard, which was at that time a dirt road. And they go up to the top of Hackberry Hill, which is essentially 72nd in Wadsworth today. And Hackberry Hill was a much steeper, much taller hill in 1926 than it is now. So it could be seen from all over the Arvada area. And the KKK burned several crosses up there. So what was the KKK's big deal about in Arvada? Well, we don't have a lot of African American, a lot of black families in Arvada, maybe one family. But we did have a lot of Italian immigrants in Arvada. For whatever reason, Arvada was just a magnet for Italian immigrants, and that's what the KKK was worried about. At Arvada High School, which was the only high school in Arvada at that time, one of the student clubs that you could join in the 1920s was the KKK club. And if you look in a 1925, certainly I know for sure in the 1925 Arvada High School yearbook, they have a listing of all these clubs. You could join the Glee Club, and you could join the Chess Club, and you could join this club, and you could join that club. You could also join the KKK club. And there are a number of Klan rallies held by students on the grounds of Arvada High School. How about that? Maybe the court case of the 1920s best represents the xenophobia of the time. Okay? So this is the court case of the time. It happens in Massachusetts, in Braintree, Massachusetts, which is just outside of Boston. There's a shoe factory that was robbed, and in the course of the robbery, a security guard was shot and killed. Now, why you're robbing a shoe factory, I don't know, but apparently somebody thought it was a good idea. So they rob a shoe factory, and they end up shooting and killing a security guard. These two guys in the photograph, Sacco and Vanzetti, were arrested for the crime. The reason that they're arrested is they're well known to Boston police because they are Italian immigrants, and they're anarchists. They have radical political beliefs. And they just happen to be walking down the street together just a couple of blocks away from the shoe factory shortly after its robbery. So they're picked up as suspects. Okay? And they're charged with the crime. They're put on trial for this robbery and murder, and the entire trial had nothing to do with the robbery or any evidence linking them to the crime because there wasn't any evidence. The only closest thing to evidence was that they happened to be in the vicinity around the time of the incident. The entire trial, however, was about them being Italian immigrants with radical political beliefs. Now, during this time, there's a gangbanger arrested in Rhode Island on a completely different charge. And in the process of being interrogated for this crime, this gang member admits to the robbery in Braintree. And he gives details that only somebody that would have been there would know. And this gang member is told, oh, it's okay. Shh. Don't worry about it. We already got a couple of Italians, and they're radicals. It's okay. Shh. We'll get you on this charge we picked you up for here in Rhode Island, but it's okay. Don't worry about anything else. It's all good. So, despite this confession by this gang member, Sacco and Vanzetti are found guilty, and they were executed because they were Italians, because they were immigrants, and because they had radical political beliefs. Something else that's not going well in America, the noble experiment. 18th Amendment outlawed the selling, producing, consuming, and possession of alcohol. Now, a couple of reasons why this had been pushed by progressives and other reformers for a long time, right? It's believed that if we got rid of alcohol, crime would go down, church attendance would go up, because it's pretty obvious that only drunk people commit crimes. And instead of sleeping off Saturday night, you'd be in church on Sunday morning. And there were women's groups that were involved in this. They believed we got rid of alcohol, we'd have better husbands and better fathers and better boyfriends, better sons, right? There were labor groups involved with this. You get rid of alcohol, you have better workers because they're sober. And there were also anti-immigrant groups involved with this who believed if we got rid of alcohol, we'd reduce the number of immigrants coming in, because the stereotype is of Irish and German immigrants is they like to drink. So if they couldn't come here and drink, they're not going to show up. So there were lots and lots of social causes involved in this 18th Amendment, the noble experiment. Crime actually goes up. Now, church attendance did go up, but that was because there was a stipulation in the law that said if consuming alcohol is a part of your religious practice, you could continue to do that. Well, I know for certain, because I'm a Catholic, I know for certain during Catholic services, you can go up and receive communion and get the communal wine. You know, it's terrible wine, but there were people that went to church specifically for that, so they could continue to drink wine legally. And they would get in line multiple times so they could have some of that wine. So people began to produce their own alcohol, and people began to distribute this alcohol. And out of this come a group of people known as bootleggers. And it was these guys' jobs to deliver alcohol to the secret bars that were out there, and to deliver to individual customers who wanted to buy the alcohol. Now, bootleggers had to be very, very careful, because obviously police were out looking for them. So one of the reasons why they're called bootleggers is that they would wear cowboy boots. And if you guys know cowboy boots, they have a very thick leather leg on the boot. And they would drop flasks of alcohol down in the leg of that boot. So if they did get pulled over and get patted down, it would be hard to feel the alcohol inside the leather of that boot. So that's where the term bootlegger comes from. Now, these bootleggers become very, very good at driving in these back road, down back roads in little towns and cities all over America, and then get very, very good at driving at very high rates of speed, going around corners. And they began to do things to their cars to make them go even faster. They began to tinker with the motor, and they began to take body parts off to make the car lighter. And they become very, very good at driving at very, very high rates of speed, trying to outlaw the police and deliver their alcohol. Out of this comes a national sport, right? Because these guys become very competitive. They want to prove who's the best bootleg driver. So you'd have competitions. And out of this, NASCAR is born. This is where NASCAR comes from. They're just driving cars that now they're specially produced cars. But originally, NASCAR was just regular everyday cars that had been tinkered with to make them go faster. And then they had the drivers driving at very high rates of speed. This is where NASCAR comes from, was from bootleggers who developed very good driving skills delivering alcohol. Now, one bootlegger becomes very, very famous and becomes very, very rich. He's an Irish immigrant, and he began to buy alcohol in Europe where it was still legal. And then he would ship it to his hometown of Boston. And he bought several warehouses on the docks in Boston where he'd sell this alcohol. He'd store this alcohol, and then he'd sell it to gangsters all over the country, and others who were running these secret bars. And in doing this, smuggling in this alcohol, he becomes enormously wealthy. And he uses this wealth, and he invests this wealth, and he does other things with this money, and he continues to grow his wealth. And in doing this, he creates a political dynasty. He will be the father of a political of an American political powerhouse. His name is Joe Kennedy. That's a picture of Joe Kennedy there. Joe Kennedy is the father of John Kennedy, Teddy Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, right? Still today, there are Kennedy great grandchildren who are serving in Congress. This is the beginning of the political dynasty of the Kennedys. Begins with Joe Kennedy, who was an Irish immigrant who smuggled alcohol in from Europe and then sold it to gangsters and other people for a lot of money. And then he did other things with that money. So this is Joe Kennedy and the Kennedy family who now become a recurring dominant force in American society. Very often, these bootleggers, they would deliver alcohol to what were known as speakeasies. Speakeasies were secret bars that you needed a membership to, and usually they were in the back of restaurants, or they're down in alleyways, or in a basement somewhere. And they're just illegal bars. That's all they were. Now, you needed a code, a password to get in, because they didn't want to let the police in. So usually you go to this big, heavy bar and you knock on the door, and a little slot in the door would open up. You can see in the picture there. And a pair of eyes would look out and they would say, password. Well, you didn't know if there were other police or, prohibition agents or somebody lurking around waiting to try to hear the password. So you'd have to say it very softly. You'd have to speak easily to give the password. And that's where the term comes from. Speakeasy. Once you give the word, the password, they open up the door and you're in. And not only in this now illegal bar are they serving alcohol, they're also figuring you're already breaking the law by drinking alcohol, might as well go all the way. So any vice that you wanted was readily available in these speakeasies. Prostitution, drugs, gambling, it was all there, right? Now, you guys all know where a speakeasy is, the Arvada Speakeasy. You just don't know that you know where it is. So if you guys know where the Arvada Tavern is in Old Town, it's right next to the Army Navy surplus. That was the speakeasy in Arvada. And it's still, I think it's shut down now because of the Rona. But when it opens back up, I hope that they keep this. It's still set up kind of like a speakeasy. So during Prohibition, the bottom floor, right? It used to be a bar before Prohibition. Then during Prohibition, the bottom floor just becomes a restaurant. And you would walk in, and there would be somebody there to greet you, a maitre d' or whatever. And you would give them the password when you walked in, the password to the speakeasy, which was up on the upper level. And they would direct you to a phone booth, right? And a phone booth, I don't know, you see them in it much anymore, but it's a little tiny room. It's a booth with a phone in it. You could shut the door and have privacy while you're on the phone. So you would go into this phone booth, shut the door. As you shut the door, one of the walls would open up in the phone booth. And that wall, as it opened up, there was a staircase that went upstairs, and upstairs was the speakeasy. Arvada Tavern still has that set up today. You go into the phone booth, you push the door, and there's the staircase upstairs. So speakeasies were a secret bar you needed a password to gain access to. Okay, once you're in, anything went. Okay. Often these speakeasies were owned by the mafia. Right, this is where the mafia becomes a very powerful, dominant force in American society. They move from being just your typical gutter-dwelling gangbangers. This is where they become legitimate, well-respected, very powerful, very wealthy businessmen. Okay, they become very respected members of the community. The most famous of these is Al Capone. They ran these speakeasies. Since they were providing these services that the community still desperately wanted, they become very powerful, very rich, very well-respected members of the community, not just some random gangbanger, out on the street. All right, movies become really important during the 1920s. This becomes the dominant form of entertainment during the 1920s. Movies do. Now, originally, movies were in their infancy were shown in the back of drugstores or in machines, right? And they were very, very short movies, like 5 minutes or so. There was no plot to them. It was all action, right? Fights or car chase or some sort of crash or something like that. And that was all there was to the movie. It was just very, very short. And it would usually cost like 10 or 5 cents to see, to go into the back of the drugstore to see it. Or sometimes it would have these cast iron, um, I don't know, machines that you would put a nickel in, and then there was a viewfinder that you could look through, and it would play the movie, right? And people were mesmerized by this, right? People just could not believe that they could see people moving that weren't there, right? See these moving pictures, these pictures that moved around. People just could not believe it. So these were very, very popular. Now, because these movies cost 5 cents to go see, either in this little cast iron machine or in the back of a drugstore, these become known as Nickelodeons. This is where the term comes from, Nickelodeons, because you paid a nickel to go see them. Eventually, the movies begin to get longer. They move from 5, 10 minute movies. Now they become 40, 45, sometimes an hour long. And they begin to develop a story with it. So there's not just action, there's some sort of plot, some sort of story. And they become even more and more popular, right? Eventually, they become so popular that they can no longer be shown in the back of a drugstore, at a grocery store, or in this little cast iron viewfinder. So special buildings began to get built specifically for movies. And these were huge movie theaters called movie palaces because they truly looked like a palace. They would have crystal chandelier and hand carved ceilings and just very ornate wood carvings on the side and plush velvet seats. The picture that you see here is of a movie palace in Chicago. Okay, and this is where you would go see movies. Now it was a one-screen theater, so every week there was a different movie, and most Americans are going to the movies every week, right, to see this new movie. So the movies move in and out very, very quickly. So Hollywood is producing a lot of movies at this time. If you've ever been to the Ogden or the Bluebird or the Paramount Theater, right? Those were originally built in the 1920s, 1930s to show movies. It was a movie palace. Now they've been refurbished. Now they do concerts and stuff there. But if you've ever been there, that's what those were. They were originally movie theaters. So people go to the movies every single week, usually Friday or Saturday night. You went to the movies. That's just what you did. Okay. By 1925, 100 million people a week are going to movies. Woof! Okay. Because of movies, we begin to get our first true national stars, that celebrities that could be recognized from coast to coast. Prior to this, you would have regional stars, right? They were live stage actors, and they would tour in a region like the Rocky Mountain region, or the West Coast region, or in the East Coast region, or in the Midwest, right? So they would become fairly popular, well recognized stars in the region, but not necessarily throughout the country. Now, because of movies, because everybody's seeing the same movie at the same time, we begin to get our first national stars. We get our first sweetheart, Mary Pickford. Oh, everybody loved Mary Pickford. She was the girl next door. She was the girl you wanted to marry. She was your sweetheart. Oh, Mary Pickford. Our first comedy star, Charlie Chaplin. He was the Will Ferrell of his time, except in his movies, he didn't run around in his underwear every single time. Charlie Chaplin becomes our first comedy star. And then our first hunk, first beefcake, Babylicious, Rudolph Valentino. When Rudolph Valentino would come on screen, women in the audience would scream and cry just at his presence on the screen. Now, Rudolph Valentino dies very, very young. He dies, I think he's 25 or 26 when he dies. Um, He had a heart condition that nobody knew about until all of a sudden he was toast to Jesus. And at his funeral, over 150,000 people showed up at his funeral, fans. When his death was announced across the country, there was a rash of female suicides because women could not imagine living in a world without Rudolph Valentino. I don't know. So there you go. As impactful as movies were, even more impactful, even more influential was the radio. The radio has the greatest impact on American society at this time. First radio station is 1920 KDKA. It's in Pittsburgh. It's still there today. By 1922, 500 radio stations are across the country. By 1926, we have our first radio network that broadcasts programming for the entire country instead of just individual local market radio stations. Now we have a network broadcasting shows for the entire country. The first network was NBC. Okay. And then radio stations begin to realize there are certain people listening to the radio at certain times, and they begin to develop shows specifically for that audience. And advertisers now are able to advertise at a certain time on a certain show and know that their target audience is listening at that time, that their message will get to the whoever they want at that time, right? Before, advertising had to be very, very general and just be very non-specific because you had to broadcast to a very general population. It was really hard to target your audience for your product. Now with radio, because they find out very quickly, there are certain people listening at various times throughout the day. So programming is going to cater to those people. You can advertise and have a very specific, very targeted message for your audience. All right, so what does the radio schedule look like? Early morning. Who's listening to the radio? Dad. Dad's getting ready to go to work, right? So dad's listening to the radio. He wants to know what happened overnight. He wants to know what the weather's going to be like. He wants to know what happened to his favorite sports team last night. So dad's listening. So you're going to have programming specifically for that. News, weather, sports. Late morning, early afternoon. Who's listening? Mom is. So you're going to have shows that mom enjoys, which are these overly dramatic, crazy stories. Lots of romance, lots of intrigue, these kind of over-the-top operatic storylines. The mom seems to enjoy listening to. These are known as soap operas, okay, because the storylines were very operatic. They were just very overly dramatic and kind of over-the-top stories. But because mom's listening, and mom's the one who does the grocery shopping, and mom's the one who cleans the house, soap and detergent cleaning products begin to advertise. And that's where you get the term soap operas. Mid-afternoon, who's listening? Kids are. They've come home from school. If you remember in Christmas Story, when Ralphie, right? Ralphie comes home and what's he waiting for? Little Orphan Annie, right? So they're putting on kids shows in the mid-afternoon. Early evening, who's listening? Well, the family is, right? They've eaten dinner and now they've gathered around the radio for the evening. So what are they going to put on? Comedy shows and variety shows, right? Like sitcoms or America's Got Talent, that kind of stuff. And then late evening, who's listening? Mom and dad are, right? Kids have gone off to bed, so now it's mom and dad. So what do they have? What's known as adult programming. It's not what you think. Not that adult programming. Come on. Adult programming would be like crime dramas or medical dramas, okay? That's what was being put on. So now advertisers could advertise at certain times and know that their target audience, the people who are most likely to buy their products, are listening, right? If you think back to Christmas Story, who advertised on Little Orphan Annie? Ovaltine, which was kind of a kid's cereal. I guess you can still get Ovaltine today, but it was like a kid's breakfast cereal. So they were advertising at that time. Okay. If you look at this schedule, this is the exact same schedule that TV is going to use when TV comes along in the 1950s. This programming schedule works so well that they just apply it to TV. And if you think of regular network TV, cable TV kind of screws everything up. But cable, regular network TV, ABC, NBC, CBS, right? Um, their programming schedule still looks like this today. Radios become, as you can see in the picture here, radios become the dominant feature in the family rooms, right? The furniture in the family rooms begin to get focused around the radio like TVs are today. 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, the furniture in your room will be focused around a radio, and a radio was a big piece of furniture. This would be a desktop radio. You would have it in your kitchen, or you have it in your bedroom, right? Or in your office. This would be on the countertop. If you've ever been in my room, I have one of these radios on my shelf behind me. So radios become very, very impactful during this time. Okay. Another thing that becomes really important, really impactful, is jazz. Jazz becomes the music of a new generation, right? Young people, teenagers of the 1920s are no different than teenagers of the 2020s. Teenagers are always teenagers. And you guys are in this weird spot in your life where you desperately want to be independent of your parents. You want to be your own person. However, you tend to kind of still rely on your parents or guardians for certain really, really cool things like a roof over your head and food on your plate, right? So you can't do anything crazy and just like, I'm out on my own. So teenagers begin to look for ways to declare their independence and do so in a safe way. The safest, most accessible way for teenagers to begin to separate from their parents has always been the clothes that you wear. Chances are you dress differently and you shop in different places than your parents do, and the music that you listen to. Chances are the music that you listen to is different than what your parents listen to, right? Now, there may be some crossover, right? There's probably some music that your parents listen to that you go, yeah, that's pretty good. And there's probably some music that you listen to that your parents go, yeah, that's pretty good. But for the most part, right, it's different. And so young people begin to really like jazz because it was something new. And most importantly, it wasn't their parents' music. It was different than what their parents liked, right? And best of all, you guys know this. If parents hated it, it was great, right? If your parents don't like it, you know it's good. Anytime you can kind of grind on your parents, God, that's a good thing. Well, parents hated jazz music. It was loud, it was fast, it was certainly different, it was sexual, and worst of all, for many parents, unfortunately, their biggest complaint was it was black. Now, jazz brings about some of the most popular and influential musicians in American history. Right? Scott Joplin writes a type of music called ragtime. Try to play a little bit of ragtime. His most famous piece of music is called "The Entertainer." I promise you, you guys have heard this before. I'm going to play this. Hopefully, it plays. Hopefully, we don't get a commercial either. We're going to get a commercial. All right, so here's the entertainer. So there was that. I'm sure you guys have heard that. George Gershwin, who writes a lot of jazz pieces, becomes one of the most famous, one of the most prominent musicians in the 20th century. His most famous piece is called Rhapsody in Blue. If you've ever seen a commercial for United Airlines or have been on United Airlines, you've heard Rhapsody in Blue. It's their theme music. So I'll play this again. I hopefully this comes across on the in the Zoom here. So there you go. Then the biggest one is Louis Armstrong. And Louis Armstrong is a big star, and he's going to be big for decades after this. Into the 60s, he'll be big. His most famous song in the 1960s, and I'm sure you guys have heard before, is, oh gosh, now I can't think of the song. Um, I can't think of the song for the life of me now. I see trees of green and grass of green, and I can't think of the song. But so, anyways, it's Louis Armstrong. He becomes very, very big during this time as well. And if I can get this here, whoops. Oh boy. If I can get to, oh, it's not going to let me. But you've heard Louis Armstrong before. All right. Well, let's talk about you guys a little bit. Teenagers, right? I just told you guys you're looking to declare your independence. Okay, begin to dress differently. Girls, in particular, girls' styles change very, very rapidly. And during the 1920s, this is no different. Girls began to cut their hair very short, right at the jawline. It's called a bob. The hemlines on their skirts come way up, right, just below the knee. So they're showing off their calves. Holy smokes, right? You can see half of a naked leg. And it was, for whatever reason, it was very desirable to have girls to have as little shape as possible, right? I mean, for whatever reason, the look of a 13-year-old boy was desirable at that time. So girls would do everything they could to get rid of any shape that they had on their body. So it was just flat, straight, no shape. And then boys and girls began to go out on dates alone. Right? Boys and girls have always dated each other. They've always liked each other, but they've never gone out alone. But now that we've got cars, now they have that capability. And this drives parents crazy. They can't believe this, right? Parents do not like this idea of girls going out alone, especially with half naked calves. What regular, normal, red blooded American male's going to be able to control himself looking at naked calves? Oh, go put some clothes on. Good Lord. So, what would you do? You would go to a speakeasy, you'd listen to some jazz, and you would do this new, shocking, lewd dance. It was so obscene. It was so bad that many cities banned it because it was too sexual. They were basically having sex with their clothes on. It's called the Charleston. Here's a little bit of the Charleston. Now this was shocking, so hopefully you guys can watch this. Hopefully it's not too shocking for everybody. And you know, oh boy, holy cow! Can you believe that? How awful! How nasty was that? What's wrong with these kids? So that was outlawed. That was just too much, right? These young women are known as flappers, right? The young, rebellious women who are doing these nasty, obscene dances and cutting their hair short and showing off their naked legs. They're called flappers. Okay? Books begin to reflect the lives of a generation, right? Movies are not quite there yet. Today we have movies that are reflect a generation. Back then it was books that captured what it meant to be a teenager in the 1920s. E. Cummings was a writer back then who he wrote a lot of poems, And he just talked about, God, how much this sucked. This is an awful time in our life. Ernest Hemingway wrote a lot of books about the great and grand adventures of life. And then the book of the generation, the book that encapsulated what it meant to be a young person in the 1920s. F. Scott Fitzgerald. Young people read this book and they went, yes, I know these people. These people know me. This is me. I get it and they get me. The Great Gatsby is the book of its generation. Teenagers would read this book and they would immediately identify with the characters in this book and their struggles and their thoughts and their feelings. It was the book that captured what it meant to be a young person in the 1920s. Now, 1920s are about heroes as well. Everybody has a hero. Every kid in America idolized, and every boy in America wanted to grow up to be Babe Ruth, who forever changes the way baseball is played. Before, baseball was you never hit home runs. Cowards, people who didn't know how to play the game, hit home runs. That was for people who just didn't appreciate or understand or know how to play the game, hit home runs. That was a very cowardly thing. Babe Ruth comes along and he just starts swinging for the fences and he's knocking the baseball all over the place. And people like it. And people realize, wow, home runs are pretty exciting. And Babe Ruth forever changes the game. Adults have their own hero, Charles Lindbergh. Charles Lindbergh is the first person to fly a plane. Planes are a very, 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 very new invention at this time. He becomes the first one to fly solo across the Atlantic. It was widely believed there would be no way you could fly across the Atlantic. It couldn't happen because you would need too much fuel to do this. And if you have too much fuel, the plane won't be able to take off. And even if somehow you were able to do that, one person couldn't do it because it was such a long flight that one person couldn't make that entire flight by themselves. Lots of people. There was a magazine publisher who put out a challenge, $5,000 for anyone that could do this. Lots of people tried. Everybody died. And then comes Charles Lindbergh. And Charles Lindbergh delivered mail by air. Charles Lindbergh thought, yeah, I'll give it a shot. So Charles Lindbergh takes his plane. He strips it completely down. So he takes out everything that he doesn't need so he can have enough fuel on the plane. He takes out the seats and he takes out the windows and he takes out all this extra weight so he could make up for that with fuel. And he takes off. And he flies to Paris. He takes off from the East Coast and he flies to Paris. Now, once he disappears in the clouds, we have no clue where he is because this is before radar. So we have no way of tracking him. We don't know if he's going to make it until he comes out of the clouds in Paris. About 15 hours later. Holy smokes! 15 hours. Can you imagine that? Okay. This flight, many thought this could never be done. Lindbergh does it. And Lindbergh becomes a legend. He becomes a massive hero in the United States. And that's the 1920s. All right, Panthers, make sure you take these notes. Make sure you turn them in. And we'll talk to you later.